As a fan of the Sega Saturn, I considered it my personal responsibility to find and play the games that made the hardware look best. Whenever I heard someone disparage the device, I wanted to have examples and proof on hand that they were dead wrong. Of course, that was when I was younger and full of piss and vinegar. These days, if you choose to skip out on the Saturn, it's your loss and none of my business. But that doesn't mean I still don't enjoy drawing attention to Saturn games that I think look great, or at the very least pull off special effects I find impressive. In part 1 of Great Visual Effects on the Sega Saturn, I went over games like Last Bronx and its pseudo 3-dimensional backgrounds. We also touched upon the hundreds of on-screen characters in Dragon Force. And we even gave some screen time to Decathlete and its stunning high-resolution visuals. If you'd like to revisit that episode, I'll drop a link in the description so you can give it a go. But while I've got you here, I've picked out 12 more games that I think would make a great part 2. We will be looking at the power of VDP-1 and VDP-2, the dual display chips that gave the Saturn its unique abilities. From sprites to backgrounds to polygons to performance and even the sheer quality of an amazing arcade port, these games all had something to offer that made them either top of their class or something you typically didn't see much of on the platform. We're going to be moving through these fairly quickly, so let's get started. "1998 brought us the treasure classic Radiant Silvergun. This one was always really impressive thanks to its gameplay model. Instead of picking up weapons at random in the field, this gives you 7 different options that can be manually switched on the fly right from the get-go. It's a tough but fair game that rewards your time and patience. On top of the gameplay, it also had some really nice visuals and backgrounds that really impressed. The Saturn's VDP-2 background chip is running at full steam here to give you gorgeous backdrops that spin, scale, and provide an overall impressive sense of depth. It's an important piece of why this game is so visually pleasing. By handling the background so effectively, VDP-2 frees up VDP-1's polygon and sprite capabilities to give you ships and special effects that look outstanding. This combination was the path to getting the best performance out of the Saturn, a melding of sprite and background rendering the way the original architect intended. Of course, not every developer had the time, money, or skill to do this, but when they did, games like Radiant Silvergun is what we saw.
紀元前の地層から発掘されたあの石のような物体であることはまず間違いないだろう。調査していた火剣三部で一体何が起こったのか。そして奴らの目的は何なのか。
I talk a fair bit about Sega's Astal, and frankly, it's because it's one of the prettiest two-dimensional games of that entire generation. I know that phrase gets repeated a lot on my channel, but here it's undeniably true. Whatever you may think of its gameplay, nobody can deny its incredible visuals. While I could spotlight many things about it I find impressive, it's the parallax scrolling I want to focus on specifically. Parallax is more than just simple layers in a game. Truly great parallax is about adding depth and beauty, looking out into the vastness and being convinced that there's a living, breathing world back there. In addition to the large, well-animated sprites in Astal, the backgrounds give you a world that could only exist in your dreams. Whether it's the dark caverns, dank swamps, or even apocalyptic storms, this game delivers the goods when it comes to two-dimensional eye candy. Many areas even throw in some full-screen scaling just because the Saturn can do it with ease. It's true Astal isn't gonna wow you with deep gameplay mechanics or some wild gimmick that's brand new. But what it lacks in innovation there, it makes up for and then some with its nearly flawless presentation. Shoot 'em ups aren't usually spotlighted for their impressive animation, but I want to shine a light on the vertically scrolling Shein Ryu. I always found this one pleasing to the eyes because of the way the enemies get destroyed. In the old days, you'd get a few frames of destruction and that was about it. But as the 1990s moved on, we started to get some really nice destruction. The ships in this one get hit, flame out, and then burst into countless pieces of shrapnel. The debris then crashes with a thud below, or splashes down in water. It's such a small thing, but it adds so much to the feeling of truly doing some damage and destruction with your fighter. I'd also like to take a moment and draw your attention to one of the boss fights, an octopus-like ship with arms moving all over. I really thought this looked great, and the Saturn does it with nary a flicker or slowdown in sight. Shienryu doesn't elicit the kind of response many of the Saturn's better shoot-em-ups do, but this is still a great game and I break it out often. If the resolution scaling bothers you, be sure to try the arcade option. It really is a great looking game. When Capcom started porting its fighting games to the Saturn, my friends and I jumped on them immediately. Getting games like X-Men, Children of the Atom, Street Fighter Alpha, and Night Warriors so close together was a great stretch of time, and we played the absolute hell out of them. As many of you know, Capcom soon began using the RAM expansion carts to make their games even better, now with shorter load times and closer animation to the arcade originals. But it was Street Fighter Alpha 2 that was so well done, not only did it not need a RAM expansion, it got even better with an upgraded release called Alpha 2 Gold. While you still see some cuts in the animation here and there, this port was just about as perfect as you could have hoped for. That's why I wanted it in this episode, just on the merits of a kick-ass port that needed nothing extra. Even with the cuts, the animation and fighters look outstanding, and the backgrounds still have just about everything that made them look great in the coin-op. The original is fine if that's all you have, but if you want the most out of your Alpha 2 experience, go with Gold. It's one of the best out there. When looking at Loaded, there isn't much about the base graphics that is particularly appealing. This top-down run and gun runs a bit janky and the textures are dark and muddy. But what it lacks in those areas, I still have to hand it to the developers for the cool-looking light sourcing and smoke effects. Whether it was the weapons in your hand or the bombs you deployed, the bullets, fire, lasers, and resulting carnage filled the screen with effects I just never got tired of. There was a visceral thrill to letting loose with the antenna mowing down everything that moved. Nothing was your friend, nothing deserved mercy, and your trigger finger was always hungry. I know, it sounds kinda disturbed when you say it that way, but I always felt letting loose in a video game was a therapeutic way of dealing with everyday stress. If you enjoy blowing things up and the resulting fireworks, Loaded is for you. Sonic Jam was a compilation of Sonic titles from the Sega Genesis. While those games have their own appeal, I want to focus on Sonic World a bit here. That was a special bonus mode that allowed you to run around a stage and view different types of media, like concept art and the full motion video from Sonic CD. But what was so special about this is the fact that it shows a reasonable approximation of what a three-dimensional Sonic could have looked like on the Saturn. While really only a single stage and a small one at that, you can't help but get the feeling that had this team been at the helm of the ill-fated Sonic Extreme, things would have turned out completely different. Of course they didn't, and we are only left with this tiny piece of what could have been. Running around in this, you get a feeling that with just a bit more polish and the gameplay could have been more than playable in a full adventure. Sonic's gameplay likely would have needed to be changed around to a more mission-based structure, sorta like the stars in Super Mario 64, but that could have been a really good thing for this series. In fact, there are a handful of missions here where you need to collect rings and other items, lending some proof that Sonic Team was onto the same idea themselves. Word is the work that started here is what eventually became Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast, but I gotta admit, I still wanted a 3D Sonic on Sega's 6 Rock from the Sun. If you've played Assault Suit Linos 2 before, you know it's a challenging fight for your life. Guns blazing, you boost on land and in the air as enemies attack you from all sides. The visuals in the stages themselves looks cool enough, but it's the first boss that'll knock your socks off. This thing is massive, one of the largest bosses I've ever seen in a video game. And to add to this behemoth, the entire screen scales in and out so that you can see the fight better. This is the kind of stuff that could put the Neo Geo to shame. I really dig this game overall, but it's nearly ruined by an escort mission about halfway through that sees failure far too easy. That first stage, however, is a real showpiece and makes you wish the rest of the game was exactly like it. Give it a go if you like the first, or Cybernator on the Super Nintendo. In my first episode, I had a section that praised the sprite work of Dragon Force. 202 troops on the screen made for one impressive showing. And while I still consider that impressive as all get out, I gotta give props to Dragon Force 2 as well. This one ups the ante a bit by giving you control over more than one troop type. That means not only can you still have 202 fighters on screen, but now you can have 4 different troop types between the 2 generals controlling them. This doesn't just have an effect on the visuals, as the gameplay has some big changes as well. With the additional troops on the screen, the same tactics before are not gonna work, giving this one an exciting new direction. This one has been growing on me over the years, and while I still prefer the original, the differences make it well worth a play. Not only does it make the gameplay appealing, but seeing all those troops go head to head at once never gets old. Once upon a time, a good console superscaler port was worth its weight in gold. Even when it wasn't perfect, just having something that resembled the arcade was really special. When Sega Age's Outrun was released on the Saturn, it was the very first time we had seen it at home at that level. But what was hidden in this game was something that was even better. In the options, you could open something called the Smooth Mode, which gave you extraordinary results. While Outrun was always smooth in the arcade, this mode gives you 60 frames per second of pure superscaling bliss. So not only was Outrun on the Saturn a great port, it was actually better than the arcade on which it was based. For years, this remained the absolute best way to play Outrun, thanks to the smooth mode and the analog control, and it's still up there today. There are many other reasons why this version of Outrun is so beloved. It has an easy cornering option, both the Japanese and overseas maps, remixed music in the Japanese original, and separate time and traffic difficulty levels. But it's the smooth mode that made it special for so very long. There's a lot to like about Psychic Curse Killer Teramaru, but the way it uses polygons, sprites, and special effects to bring two-dimensional gameplay to life was really something else. The entire game pops visually with great transparencies, a near constant flow of scaling enemies, and 3D architecture that scrolls by in the scenery. It wasn't just the sprites that scaled either, because sometimes the entire playfield would pan out to give you a much larger view of the area. The lock-on gameplay aside, you have to wonder if Sega made a huge mistake not bringing forward its entire Genesis lineup with this type of engine. Imagine a Shinobi, Comic Zone, Ristar, or Shakan made this way. Sometimes the entire screen would move and rotate or present dangers that would spin from the foreground to the background, putting the player in danger at different times. This 2.5D method of rendering was used before in games like Clockwork Knight, but I think it looks so much better here. The art plays a big part in that, but by keeping focus on the sweet two-dimensional sprites of the Saturn, it really allows some great looking interaction with the polygon elements. It takes a while to get used to the way it plays, but it never stops looking great in the process. Soukyugurentai is another one where I really enjoyed the constant scaling and zooming backgrounds, enemies, and weapon fire. There are even some 3D polygon touches to this one. Think of this as sort of another layer section type game where you need to lock onto enemies at different heights and blow them out of the sky or destroy them on the land. Like many shooters on the Saturn, you get some great layered transparencies with water and clouds while all the other stuff is going on. It only slows down here and there and even supports 2 players with these visuals. The only real blemish on this otherwise fantastic looking game are some mesh transparent explosions on the larger enemies, but in no way does that ruin the presentation. Between the busy special effects, the massive boss ships, and the great scenery changes, this is one of the better looking shooters that you should definitely try. It supports the 3D analog pad and the mission stick, and is sometimes called Terra Driver outside of Japan. Our last game was chosen because it was one of those sports games that just showed the Saturn could paint a 3D engine worth talking about. World League Soccer 98 was a multi-platform release where the Saturn more than held its own. It runs at a higher resolution than its PlayStation counterpart and still maintains great performance. I mean, how can a third-party game look like this with polygon players, a polygon stadium, a massive textured field, and an animated crowd, yet Sega can't get a decent NFL title running on their own machine? This was a 1998 release when the Saturn had been on the market for nearly 4 years, and it shows that the notion of the platform being weak in games like this simply isn't true. Saturn had the ability, it just took a developer that could actually code well to get it out of it. There's other examples of this kind of thing as well. World Series Baseball 98 and Worldwide Soccer 98 were also pretty impressive in overall visual quality. But even if you aren't a soccer fan, you have to respect what developer Silicon Dreams pulled off with this one. They used their previous Olympic soccer engine and improved on it impressively. A third party putting this much effort into a sports title when the platform was practically dead earns it some major respect from me. Since it has 200 teams, 14 stadiums, 6 surface types, and running commentary, it's still quite playable today.
He's hit the post! What a brave tackle then, he just threw himself at the player's feet. The beautiful cross by Collins. Donnelly! Yes! 2-0!
Since I have enjoyed this topic so much, I will be adding a part 3 to this series using viewer recommendations. so please feel free to add your games to the comments below. While the Saturn's undeniably complicated architecture did it no favors during its run, I think it's complete nonsense to call the machine underpowered. When you had those chips working together in harmony, the Saturn could paint a screen of visuals with the best of them. With the Dreamcast replacing it just 4 years into its run, we never really saw what second and third generation software engines could have accomplished, at least not outside of the major third parties like Capcom and of course Sega themselves. It may seem like Saturn was best at two-dimensional visuals using sprites and traditional backgrounds, but I also feel there are more than enough examples showing that developers that really tried accomplished some great things with polygons as well. It's a bit more difficult to appreciate that these days because the 2D graphics of that generation hold up so much better. But in a lot of ways, the Saturn even had a number of gems in that regard, because so many of the games used both two-dimensional and three-dimensional elements together seamlessly. I tried to highlight some of them here, and I hope you agree they were well worth talking about. I'm SegaLordX, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.